War. It is an unfortunate part of our past and our present, yet it is a universal human trait. Whether for land, political ideology, or resources, humans seem to have always waged war on each other. And as neighbors become more experienced at waging war on each other, they also get more experienced about defending themselves against it. High walls and fortifications were built not to keep out the world, but to keep out roving raiders and enemy combatants. Those who meant no harm could come and go almost as easily as we walk into them today as a tourist, but anyone who meant harm would have a harder time. From these ancient fortresses, you could see from all angles and gain the high ground in any battle. Citadels were literal keys to the kingdom, and taking one of them, especially in a strategic city, could shift the war in your favor, forcing the victor to either make concessions, retreat, or conduct a second costly offensive. Therefore, it's incredibly important to make sure that if you assault a fortress, you should take it. And there were very few better ways to do this than with a siege. So how were ancient sieges conducted, and what marks did they leave behind?
Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
The way humans have conducted sieges has remained relatively constant. Surround the city and cut it off from supplies, set up defenses to prevent being flanked, and get past the walls by any means necessary. In the ancient world, sieges were a common tactic of warfare, and victories were celebrated, with good reason. Sieges were costly, and the attackers were usually at a disadvantage. Defenders knew the city and defenses much better than the attackers, they had the high ground, and they had cover, so defenders could return fire more easily while making the invaders' job harder. In addition, the attacking army had limited resources, and if surrounding land could not provide enough for your army to live on, you also risked starvation and exposure. Because your army was away from home, you also risked a drop in morale. Close quarters meant illness spread quicker, and most dangerously, the enemy might have time to bring in reinforcements from behind, trapping you with open battle on one side and a newly energized set of defenders on the other. In the medieval world, a passive siege to starve a castle was the norm, but in the ancient world it was more complicated. While passive sieges did happen, many ancient empires preferred a direct assault or active siege on the citadel rather than camping out and blockading its supply lines. It wasn't because this was less costly, but because of ideological implications. They represented not just a strategic aim for a wider campaign, but also served as a symbol of power and intimidation. It represented the strength of your military and, by extension, your authority. This isn't to say that you always did this, or that you went in guns blazing, so to speak. You prepared the siege ahead of time, burning fields and outlying villages, you negotiated surrenders, and ideally the citadel was primed to fall before you even arrive. So ancient armies simply continued on until the city either negotiated or burned it down. Such battles left a mark on the archaeological record, and these marks are the ones we are still able to see even thousands of years later. And with this in mind, I've lined up an example of several sieges to talk about today, done by armies not just looking to achieve a strategic goal, but also to intimidate and show off the strength of their army and their authority in a world where might made right. The first siege I'm going to start off with is the Siege of Lachish, one of the oldest surviving sieges in the archaeological record and the only surviving example of an Assyrian siege ramp. The people who built this ramp, the Neo-Assyrians, had the most feared army in the world at the time. While the Assyrians did not invent the siege, they certainly did perfect it, being the first army in the world to integrate tactical sieges into their military infrastructure, employing people as sappers, engineers, and archers, and dragging battering rams and siege towers into battle. Experts at battle and strategy, the Assyrians were also well-equipped and technologically advanced, expanding militaristically across the Near East and laying waste to whole kingdoms, subjugating even Egypt itself. But before tackling Egypt, the Assyrians swept across the Levant, their conquest depicted in the Bible. Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Samaria, but the southern kingdom of Judah survived. And the reason for that is the Siege of Lachish. While Judah lost the battle, it did allow them to win the war, or at least survive it, which, up against the Assyrians, can count as a win. The Siege of Lachish is of course mentioned in the Bible, but it is also depicted on a relief at Sennacherib's palace, and evidence can still be seen in the city itself. It's one of those rare cases where the Bible, archaeological evidence, and historical records all actually line up. For those of you unfamiliar with the battle, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, ascended the throne in 705 BCE. During his reign, he sought to expand his borders, bringing him to Judah in 701. One of the key points of entry to Judah was Lachish, at the time a heavily fortified settlement on the road to Judah's capital, Jerusalem. Now, Assyrians didn't really do the passive siege. They were more of a smash-it-down sort of army. Lachish was heavily fortified, with walls too high for ladders, forcing the use of battering rams and siege towers. But the gates of Lachish, as you can see, were approached from an odd angle. Now, the city gates are usually the weakest points along the wall, so Lachish, in order to compensate for this, made sure that you could only approach the gate in a sideways fashion. And what's more, you did it with your right side exposed to the walls. Shields were typically worn on the left side. It prevented not only an easy assault, but made the placement of battering rams and siege towers near the gates almost impossible. This is why the Assyrians built a ramp, to get those siege engines up there by any means necessary. In the Museum of Jerusalem, you can see a number of devices both sides used. Metal grappling hooks used by Assyrians, projectiles such as sling stones, and all manner of weapons and armor. This battle was intense. But even here, it wasn't just a random ramp. You'll see the Assyrians built it into a corner. Not just any corner either, but the narrowest corner, meaning that the defenders had limited space to return fire. And the relief Sennacherib made of the battle suggests as much, with defenders in the back not firing because they had no room to move. But this had a disadvantage too, in that it made it easier for the defenders to swiftly add both height and thickness to the wall, which indeed they did do, which you can see from the top of the site. The Assyrians did indeed triumph, but it was such a hard-fought battle that Sennacherib put a relief of it in his throne room in Nineveh. And although this was supposed to brag about his victory, it is also sort of a testament to the defenders. You don't just put any random victory in a throne room, after all. You want to showcase the one you're proud of, and it's not like the Assyrians were short of options. But in addition, the defenders also did have some sort of win. It bought time for Jerusalem. Having lost its key fortress of Lachish, Jerusalem was forced to become a vassal, but thanks to the time and resources that siege cost the Assyrians, they retained their independence, however nominal. The course of human history was quite literally changed by this very battlefield. Sieges continued to be used as a preferred method of warfare in the Assyrian successor states as well. The Persians, one of these successors, famously waged a war against Greece. This was a problem for Greece, as the Persians were the superpower of the ancient world and had strings of victory after victory at the time. So, when the Persians were able to hold a city to siege, they tended to have the advantage. And to get to Greece, they needed to go through Cyprus.
So where I'm standing now is the walls of old Paphos. And these are really interesting because here there is a siege that archaeologists found evidence of that history actually kind of forgot to record. See, according to Herodotus, the Ionian revolt occurred in Cyprus only on one or two areas and never really hit Paphos, but here we see a Persian siege dated to the right time of the Ionian revolt. And why was Paphos so significant to the Persians? Apart from keeping their empire intact, Paphos had that nice wide harbor behind me. By securing Paphos, they secured the harbor, and thus they secured their route to the west and to further the Greco-Persian wars and the Aegean coastline.
So taking the city was pretty important. And because this is a siege only known through archaeology, it means that we only know what the archaeology shows us. And it's a good thing that it can show us quite a lot. In fact, along with the other two sites in this video, it's one of the few that can be reconstructed so thoroughly. So what does it tell us? Well, like Lachish, we see a siege mound, in this case built of pieces from an old altar. We know this is an old altar because over 1,000 fragments of votive offerings were found within. The Persians actually ripped down a Cypriot altar to build the ramp and besiege the town, which is quite interesting to see. As a result, some ancient Indo-Cypriot writing was actually preserved, encased as part of the rubble in the wall. And the Persians, too, are quite bold, because this ramp led up to the gate, which, like Lachish, was heavily fortified. Now, it didn't quite go at an angle, but it was flanked by two towers. No, not those two towers, though that would be pretty cool. These two towers. And this means the Persians were directly attacking one of the most fortified parts of the city just to get at the weakest point in the walls, flanked on either side by archers and spearmen. As expected, hundreds of bronze and iron weapons were found in this area too, including the oldest Greek helmets discovered in a battle context. And, like at Lachish, we can see that these defenders fought hard. The Greeks saw this ramp coming, but they didn't sit back idly. They actually dug tunnels underneath their own walls and attempted to burn the siege ramp down from within.
Alright, so what you see here is the Persian siege ramp. And some of these holes are what the Greeks dug under them. They were attempting to stick fire and stuff down there to burn the ramp down from below, but they failed. Instead, this ramp came up here and began to besiege the Greeks despite all their best efforts.
But these efforts seemed to come to nothing. The fire seems to have failed to catch, and the Persians marched on. But evidence of burning by one side or the other is still present.
So now this is something really interesting about sieges. This here is the natural color of the soil. But if we go to the other side, what you see is that this is a much sharper orange. It's also much harder to pick at too. What it has, it's been oxidized, it's been burned. This was a field of fire during the Persian siege, and you can still see marks of it right here in the sediment. Welcome to archaeology.
Yep, that is what studying the dirt can tell you. Not so useless now, is it, Dad? But the point is, our stories are hidden in the dirt, and archaeology is the key to reading them. These fires burned down the gates of the city, and the Persians secured a valuable port. We know from Herodotus that the longest siege on Cyprus lasted 5 months, so Paphos probably fell within that time frame. The materials also found date firmly to the 6th century BCE, meaning that this was almost definitely part of the Ionian Revolt, placing the siege around 498 BCE. Greece famously held the Persians off, but it's important to note the Greeks never won a siege, at least not against the Persians. The Greeks beat the Persians using a series of strategic choke points combined with naval superiority. But on land, in the open, the Persians were masters of war, nearly unbeatable at this time period. And Paphos is a good example of that. Like I said, it's pretty ballsy to launch a full frontal assault on the fortified gate of a major port, but to win is even more impressive. And the Greeks knew this, which is why they only engaged the Persians at strategic points where they knew they could win. Fight smarter, not harder. But the Greeks, when they did beat the Persians, had a lot of land, people, and resources behind them. This was not the case for the defenders of our final siege, Masada. Just as the Persians learned siegecraft from the Assyrians, the Greeks learned it from the Persians and passed it on to the Romans. Now, I've discussed the context of Masada mostly in earlier videos, so as a quick recap, in 66 CE, the satellite kingdom of Judea in the Roman Empire launched a major revolt, leading Vespasian and later his son Titus to put it down. Jerusalem was burned to the ground along with the Second Temple, and then a small band of holdouts fled to Masada, where they endured a long siege only to fall in 73 CE. Now, unlike the first two, this was not a pitched battle backed by independent states, but rebels against the Roman Empire. Rome could have starved them out, or taken it with a small contingent of men, or even just ignored it and let the desert do its job. After all, Masada only had limited resources and it could not hold out forever. But this wasn't just about putting down a rebel faction, it was about sending a message. Rome sending an entire legion to besiege Masada was objectively overkill, but they wanted to send a powerful message: do not mess with Roman authority. And by many accounts, this did work, and it worked pretty quickly. And again, I've discussed more of this in a previous video, but recent evidence has come out changing the typical narrative. The siege of Masada, contrary to popular belief, did not take years, but rather a few weeks. And now, this doesn't surprise me much, to be honest. Romans were a powerful army, and when they got determined, they could break almost any wall, and Masada rebels were not that well equipped. No, what surprised me was that of the 4 men who led the team who discovered this, 2 of them are Ashkenazi and Omer Ze'evi-Berger, both of whom I have had the pleasure of working with when I was in Israel 10 years ago. I've cited their paper in the description below. By the way, down there is also a link to my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel, and please do remember to like and subscribe, because these aren't the only professionals I've worked with, and I'd love to have the opportunity to showcase more of my colleagues' achievements in future videos. Anyway, what do Hai and Omer say? Essentially, they set out to map the siege system and walls and basically estimate the amount of work required both in time and in manpower. And this is a relatively intact siege system, well preserved thanks to the desert and the relative isolation. You can see that, like at Lachish, the Romans chose the point of easiest access, not coming up from the steep cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, but from the back where they could leverage higher terrain, carting in water from the nearby Ein Gedi oasis. Their study was actually a comprehensive landscape analysis which has not really been done on Masada before, and certainly not to this scale. And what they found was that the Romans utilized a lot of effort and manpower to this task. One of the Roman camps was built with defensive walls that could only be effective while fighting mounted, like so, finding stairs in the siege camp. They built towers very close to Masada where they lacked topographical advantage, and they even had some sections built purely for psychological warfare, along with alternate assault routes should their first one fail. In essence, this really was a show of intimidation and strength, given it was for a relatively small amount of defenders who could not possibly defend all the walls at once. And I'm afraid I'm really not doing this study any justice, but this video is about sieges and their archaeological marks, while this study is more concerned with architecture and landscape analysis. But I do think it's worth going over this paper in detail after you finish watching my video, however, as they do provide a lot of diagrams and far more comprehensive analysis. And while it does find the siege was over much quicker than the classical narratives suggest, news articles suggesting this was the only thing it did are greatly misrepresenting just how comprehensive this study was. The team did not set out to challenge any of the social narratives, they merely conducted a thorough analysis and drew new conclusions from that. And the main conclusion for this video's purpose is that this whole siege system that the Romans built took only around 9 days, which is very rapid. Now, imagine being this ragtag band of defenders fleeing here with relatively low-quality weapons and seeing this whole legion of Romans arrayed outside your walls, erecting this whole siege system in less than 2 weeks. Clearly, this would have been terrifying, and this was what the Romans intended, but it wasn't just for show. With the force of a full legion working this quickly, is it any wonder that the siege was over in a matter of weeks? But even here, the defenders could send a message of their own. The Masada defenders famously committed suicide rather than surrender. They did this by drawing lots, and the truth of this is at least alluded to in the discovery of ostraca, or potsherds with writing on them, bearing the names of Jewish defenders that had been found in previous excavations, not by this one that my 2 friends have conducted. It was said that they left out their food and ammunition, showing the Romans that they did not commit suicide because they were out of supplies, but because they would rather die than submit to Roman authority. The Romans had mastered siege warfare in the ancient world, but these sorts of sieges were falling out of fashion. Although passive sieges to starve the enemy out of resources were not unheard of in the ancient world, it is clear that it was more of a sign of power and authority to ram through where you could, and take every opportunity to show strength. But as defenses evolved, this became more costly and made less strategic sense. These powerful full-frontal sieges had to become a thing of the past. As the world moved on, defenses got stronger. Hill forts appeared, making sieges harder, and then castles arrived after that. Sieges through starvation became far more common, as ancient assaults proved inadequate. And defenders got better at defense, leading to a rise in castles and a whole new evolution of sieges. But that is a video for another time. For now, that's all I have to say on sieges and some sites in the ancient world. And thank you for making it to the end of the video, and until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.